Hello and welcome back to another video. So as you can see, this video is not really about the on-field expeditions that we do here normally on this channel. This is more of technical talk. So recently I got my hands on the Sony Alpha a7R5, which is having a 61 megapixel sensor. Whopping 61 megapixel sensor if you are already not aware of this. The other camera that I'm shooting with right now is the Sony a7Mark IV, which is my primary video and hybrid camera. The Sony a7Mark IV has a 33 megapixel sensor. Now, before buying the a7R5, I was looking for a lot of information on the internet which should give me a little bit more of a context of how the 61 megapixel sensor performs when it comes to low light, maybe even downsizing the raw file size and all these things. But I could not really find a lot of information readily available over the internet. The main problem with the a7R5, not only the a7R5, with any high resolution sensor body that you will be having, are the file sizes. For example, the a7R5 with its uncompressed RAW spews out nearly 130-140 MB uncompressed RAW files. To mediate these, Sony has given a few more modes here on this R5, which are compressed L, compressed M, compressed S. Now all of these modes are supposed to be lossless. However, through my testing I have found all of these modes behave a little bit differently from each other. What I've done is I've done a few completely non-scientific tests using the files from a7Mark IV as well as the R5, and here are my findings. So first we'll take a look at how the uncompressed raw files from the a7R5 compare with the compressed L as well as the uncompressed raw files from the a7Mark IV. So as you can see, the compressed L and the uncompressed raw file from the R5 has no difference at all in terms of noise, in terms of detail, nothing. So effectively, when you are shooting with the compressed L as well as the uncompressed raw, you would not be losing any resolution, neither would you be losing any kind of details, nor would you be gaining any kind of sharpness, nothing. So it's exactly the same. However, it changes drastically when you take a look at the compressed M. So now we're taking a look at the compressed M raw file. As you can see here, the compressed L and the compressed M has a tiny difference of noise. So the compressed M is having lesser noise than the compressed L and the uncompressed raw file as well. That is quite evident here. The compressed M file has a lot less noise. The compressed M raw file has noise patterns which is pretty similar to the a7Mark IV uncompressed raw file. Up next, we'll take a look at how these files behave when we crank up the ISO to 3200 and keep the rest of the settings intact in terms of exposure. The first file is the uncompressed raw file from the R5, which shows a lot of noise, and the second one is the compressed L, and as you can see, the compressed L and the uncompressed file has zero difference. But when you move to compressed M, again the noise pattern here is much lesser compared to the compressed L as well as the uncompressed one. And as you can see, the compressed M is having noise pattern which is very similar to the a7 IV uncompressed raw file. So the next question that struck me is, could I use a compressed L raw file from the R5 and use noise reduction to reach similar noise levels to the a7Mark IV? Is that possible at all? Let's take a look. So if we use the compressed L raw file from the R5 and we increase the noise reduction, we will find that at one point these noise levels becomes almost equal to the a7Mark IV noise pattern. However, you lose a little bit of the detail which you cannot really get back. Next, we'll take a look at images which are overexposed by a couple of stops. Again, the first raw file is from the R5, which is completely uncompressed, and as you can see here, we have overexposed this file by quite a bit. When we turn down the exposure, we reach one point. Of course, it is blown out, as you can see here, but again the compressed L and the uncompressed raw is able to recover exactly the same amount of information, nothing more and nothing less. However, the scenario changes completely when you move to compressed M. All of these images are having the same settings, no changes at all. Now when you bring down the exposure of the compressed M, you cannot recover most of the information that you are able to recover from the uncompressed as well as the compressed L in the R5. So in other words, the compressed M is having lesser dynamic range, hands down, period. But as usual, the a7 Mark IV is having similar kind of dynamic range to the R5, if not a tad lesser, I would say, but it's 9900 sort of a difference, very fine margins. The final test we have is to stop underexposed images. Let's take a look. So again, the first file is uncompressed raw file from the R5. As you can see, we can crank up the exposure and get back a lot of details in the shadows. If we take a look at the noise pattern, again, when we increase the exposure of the compressed L, we are getting very similar amount of noise as well as noise patterns as the uncompressed file. The compressed M, when we take up the exposure and bring it up to the exact same exposure levels as the other files, is again having lesser amount of noise compared to the compressed L as well as the uncompressed raw file. The a7 IV, as usual, is having similar kind of noise patterns to the uncompressed raw files from the R5. So what does this sum up to? I have some notes here, I'll take a look. So the conclusion is the standard exposure, when we are maintaining the same exposure levels, the correct exposure levels across all the images, we are getting the compressed M has lesser amount of noise compared to the uncompressed as well as the compressed L raw files from the R5. Compressed M therefore has lesser noise. And the a7 Mark IV uncompressed raw file is having similar amount of noise pattern like we have in the R5 uncompressed as well as compressed L. Big words. Secondly, the ISO 3200 file, the compressed M again has lesser amount of noise if you compare to the a7 IV as well as the uncompressed raw file from the R5 as well as the compressed L from the R5. If you do not know, the compressed M turns down the resolution of the 61 megapixel sensor from the R5 to a 26 megapixel. Maybe that is why you are seeing lesser amount of noise. However, these are my findings. The question that I had was, could I use the R5 raw file to get similar amount of noise pattern to the a7 Mark IV? We could use noise reduction to get similar amount of noise, but we lose a little bit of the sharpness. It's almost 90 to 95% image quality of the a7 Mark IV. What about the overexposed files? The compressed M raw file has much lesser dynamic range compared to the uncompressed as well as the compressed L raw files from the R5. It's quite a bit lesser. You cannot recover that much details from the compressed M raw file of an R5. And the rest of the files, that is the uncompressed and the compressed L from the R5, can recover similar amount of details from the shadows as you can do from the a7 Mark IV. And the underexposed files, if we bring that up to the standard exposure levels, the uncompressed and the compressed L raw files from the R5 has again very similar identical noise patterns. Compressed M from the R5 has much lesser noise, and the a7 Mark IV, it has noise patterns which is similar to the uncompressed and the compressed L from the R5. Hopefully that clarifies a few things for you. Anybody who is looking for this information over the internet and looking for a purchase of the a7R5, maybe this will be helpful. Nonetheless, just a short video. I'll see you in the outdoors. Bye for now.